the following: we're not here to see through each other. We're here to see each other through. And that line, or the kind of 2-line pithy statement there, got me thinking about how I need to help SAP see through the fact that they don't get it. I had to find a home for my 120 odd team members because I had decided to leave because I was not in a sweet spot with SAP. So I had to see these folks through. I had to make sure they all had jobs and make sure they were all taken care of. And so once that all was done, once I sort of made peace with myself, I announced my departure and then used that kind of purpose statement from 2008 onwards.
Just to wrap up, we know you've written several books, Dan. We know you're out there. We'd love for you to just tell us where people can learn more about your work and how they can connect with you.
Maybe we'll just go to the latest book. It's called Lead Care Win, and you just go to leadcarewin.com and you'll find me and the book and all the rest of them there, including The Purpose Effect.
Thanks for sharing your wisdom around this, Dan, and your personal story as well.
Thanks for doing what you're doing.
A couple of weeks after we recorded that interview with Dan Pontefract, and hot on the heels of the results of the US election, Danny, Stacia, and I sat down to reflect on what we'd learned from that conversation, and also to share in general what's going on around the topic of purpose, purpose-driven organizations, and stakeholder capitalism. And boy, it was a lot. Here's Danny Johnson reflecting back on the conversation that we'd had with Dan Pontefract.
So a couple of things that really sort of hit me with his that I'm still thinking about, even weeks after, is this idea of purpose not just being an organizational purpose. He talks about individual purpose, team purpose, and then organizational purpose. And I think that's an idea that was maybe not top of mind for me. Stacia's a little bit deeper into this research, so she might have thought through it. But the sort of the need to align those within organizations is becoming a bigger deal, I think. And organizations are beginning to see that one purpose for everybody may not work as well as we think it did in the past.
Yeah, I think you called it role or team purpose. I think he may have said role purpose. I'm not sure which, but I think that middle bridge, whatever it is something that we haven't been discussing that much, because you can have your own purpose and you can have a clear organizational purpose. But if the role you're in or the team you're serving on doesn't enable you to achieve either of those, even if those two outlier, the organizational, your own individual purposes are aligned, if you don't have that middle one, he pointed out that it can kind of fall apart. I think that's a good point. Something else he said right at the beginning really struck me in terms of maybe why this has become such a big thing in 2020. And he said that we need to spend more time marinating in the moment. We're addicted to busyness, distraction, social media, etc. And in some ways, potentially, COVID and the slowing down, the forced slowdown, I think maybe has forced this conversation for many of us on what our purpose is and why we're doing what we're doing. And that may be extending to organizations. So that idea of this continuous busyness has slowed us down and forced us to think. I thought that was a nice concept.
I think that's extending to society.
Yeah.
And I really think a lot of the conversations that we've been having around race and social justice is in part because people were given the time to stop and think and then make their voices heard. Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. I also like that he came to his thinking about purpose from thinking about leadership and change in TELUS. It sort of came out of that kind of leadership discussion. I thought that was an interesting trigger for this work.
Yeah, and I think the connection that he made between purpose and empathy in particular was really nice. I feel like in general, through other work that we've done, we've heard a lot about the importance of empathy, particularly during COVID, and the need to, I think he said, to fill an empathy gap. And I think that purpose has helped to do that. And, he's used a term that several others have used, this great reset concept of, how we're redefining ourselves in our work. But I think that when you kind of combine those two concepts of empathy and this reset, maybe we will come back after all this as a somewhat, at least more thoughtful, if not hopefully kinder, gentler, and more empathetic group of people.
Let's hope so.
I also like the point that he made about short-termism, I think he called it, which kind of goes back to discussions we've had before, serving the stock market and analysts every quarter. Like you have to show something every quarter, and how purpose is It's like the fast food movement versus the slow food movement. It takes time. You have to sort of marinate in it. There's a reason that you're doing this that has long-term effects that is very lost if you're just looking at a balance sheet or financial results.
Yeah, I agree.
Great. Good conversation. We also wanted to do, as part of this episode, a mid-season update. I mean, we've been recording these conversations. We're publishing them on a 2-week cycle. And I think it's probably confirmation bias, but everywhere I look, I see the word purpose now. I wanted to give you a little quote from a Joe Biden speech.
I found the best way through pain and loss and grief is to find purpose. As God's children, each of us have a purpose in our lives. We have a great purpose as a nation to open the doors of opportunity to all Americans, to save our democracy, to be a light to the world once again, and finally to live up to and make real the words written in the sacred documents that founded this nation, that all men and women are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Again, this sort of led idea of there's individual purpose, there's organizational purpose, there's the purpose of your role and your work, and then the purpose of society around you. It's a powerful leadership tool, and there's somebody bringing that tool to the forefront as they move into a leadership position. I thought that was interesting, but it probably is my confirmation bias.
I think it is everywhere right now. And the question, and I think one of the things we've been trying to answer with this podcast is, will it stand the test of time? So I think a lot of people have seen the benefits, have kind of grabbed onto them. And then the question is, will we continue to do it? Will we continue to focus on it in 2022?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know whether either of you saw this report from the KKS advisors. It was a really interesting report that came out in September. It's called COVID-19 and Inequality, a Test of Corporate Purpose. And it was a specific report looking at the Business Roundtable's statement from just about a year ago. And it's a very interesting report. They used a technology to sort of scrape information, a lot of information, and I guess it's AI and sentiment analysis to really do a sort of evaluation of how those Business Roundtable companies were performing through this change. Exactly, what we were hoping to get some evidence of when we kicked off this project. They had 4 things that they came up with. They said that, yes, indeed, there was a lot of purpose washing going on. They said that companies that had the longest term commitment to purpose outperformed the others. It's a little bit, companies like J&J, for example. They talked about speed mattering in terms of response to sort of crisis situations. And they also talked about this purpose as a global momentum, not just a North American phenomenon. And we've talked to some global firms too. But what I really liked about this report more than anything else was there was some real tangible parameters that they looked at. For example, they basically created we talked before about how difficult it is to measure this. They had a really interesting framework. So, for example, one of the parameters was employee engagement, diversity, and inclusion. And so they look for specific markers around that, like board diversity, actions taken around sexual harassment, worker discrimination cases based on race, gender, etc., worker pay gap, and how much transparency a company had around maybe, say, gender pay gaps or whatever, and also executive pay for performance versus the actions that we're taking against the workforce. So what I loved about this report was here's some really tangible things that you can use to hold companies accountable for actions around their purpose statement.
I think the group came together supposedly really as a result of the Business Roundtable's statement to kind of test whether Business Roundtable groups were doing better than others. In kind of reading through this report, I took a little bit of issue with that first finding because I thought it was we write reports. I know what a headline looks like to grab some headlines, and it felt to me like that's what it was. I think their exact thing was that purpose washing unmasked, saying that the BRT signatories did not outperform their S&P 500 or European company counterparts. And that's fine, but if you believe that this commitment to purpose for some of these organizations is new, or it's going to change the way that they're operating. And we heard from one organization in the podcast where that is the case. The signature actually has encouraged them to make changes. If that's the case, no, you're not going to see a difference in a year. And that's exactly what we've been talking about. But then they go on to say, well, those who had a long track record and commitment, they are outperforming. So it's kind of like, well, obviously, right? A year is not, especially this type of year, is not enough time to make a significant change in your practices, and certainly not your financial performance as measured by stock price or something like that. So that first finding I felt was a little bit disingenuous, because those who are committed have done that.
And I also think it's a little bit ironic that financial performance was how they were measuring whether purpose was worth it or not. You know what I mean? It sort of moved past the whole idea we're doing this because financial performance isn't the only thing that matters. And then they went directly to financial performance is the way that we're going to measure whether or not this was worth it. And as Stacia said, it definitely doesn't take into account the long game that is purpose. It is a long game. It's not a short game at all. It's a long game, and you do it for completely different reasons than just financial gain.
One takeaway for me was there's a lot of stakeholders around this topic. I mean, so part of the report was a lot of statements from various organizations who are tracking this and focused on this and supporting this. And I thought that was interesting. It felt like a movement.
I also take just a tiny bit of issue with somebody else identifying what purpose is or what the metrics are that we use to measure purpose. You know what I mean? Obviously, we all want better diversity and inclusion. We all want these things. But in the organizations that we've talked to, this is a very internal thing. It's a feeling that pervades the organization, and it's clear in talking to these leaders, their buy-in to this idea. And so anytime we put metrics on something, especially anytime external people put metrics on something internal, it seems less like purpose and more bureaucratic, can I say bullshit on this, that keeps us from reaching the ultimate goal.
Well, yeah, but Danny, you were the one who early on
Don't tell my words in my face.
I think what I like here is you pointed out that we have accounting standards, and we have all kinds of legislation and measures around the financial performance of a company. What we don't have is similar measures around the purpose focus of a company. And what I found in here were things like, well, Aaron Hurst mentioned this in the conversation. He said, look at where companies are spending money on lobbying and see how that aligns to their purpose. And I think like this was, look at how companies are spending money on senior executives versus doing layoffs. I saw some parameters emerging here that were interesting, because we're going to need a framework if stakeholder capitalism is going to continue to gain momentum.
And this is where I think I've grown as a person, Chris, because I'm not sure. I'm not sure I believe that anymore. I'm not sure we need external measures. I think as long as the measures are clear in however that particular organization is measuring, I'm good with that. If they're fulfilling their purpose and focusing on the things that matter to the purpose that they have, I'm good with that.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting. One of the other things that's happened since we started recording this podcast is the World Economic Forum, in consultation with the big four accounting firms, came out with a new set of standards, which they're calling the stakeholder capitalism metrics, and disclosures that can be used to kind of align their mainstream reporting on performance against environmental, social, and governance indicators, and then track their contributions towards the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So there is actually a very concerted effort towards trying to standardize those measures. What's kind of interesting, though, about those is if you dig into it, they have a set of, and this is where it starts to get a little bit horrifying, of 21 established core metrics that basically you're already reporting on, and you're reporting on in other contexts, and it's relatively easy for you to report on. But then they have, Danny, you're going to love this, 34 expanded metrics that are less well established and that have a wider value chain scope, which means they probably actually measure better. But that means between the two of them, we have what you should never do math live, but between